Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Laura. I'm one of the youth librarians at Cedar Mill Library, and Jenny, my colleague, is here also. And we're very excited to have an expert with us, Dr. Dawn Hendricks. She has more than 20 years of experience in her field, including serving as director of early childhood services in a statewide Head Start program, serving nearly 3,000 infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. She co-wrote the country's first bilingual early reading first project, leading a team that established 20 model bilingual classrooms that received national recognition. Dr. Hendricks is bilingual and teaches college courses in both English and Spanish. She focuses on providing culturally and linguistically responsive teacher education to meet the diverse needs of today's early childhood workforce. So without further delay, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Dawn Hendricks.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, Jenny. And thanks for your organization and putting this together and inviting me to be here with all of you today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is dual language learning in early childhood. So welcome to all of you. I'm glad that you are here, especially when it's sunny outside. And I know in the Northwest, when we get glimpses of sun, it's hard to focus on other things. So thanks for taking time out of your day to be with us here this evening. So in addition to what Laura shared, I am a department chair at Clackamas Community College. And in that capacity, my team and I recently developed the nation's first Spanish language early childhood degree program. And we developed that because we knew that Spanish-speaking early learning staff who were already working in classrooms or as family child care providers needed to have access to content and access to curriculum to support their role in supporting children and families. So we've had that program, that early childhood degree program in Spanish now for 3 years, and we have over 300 students who are actively taking courses. And we've had about 55 Latinx Spanish-speaking students graduate with their associate's degree. So this is something that I enjoy talking about around early language and literacy learning, and how we support families, but then also how we support teachers and other folks who work with young children and their families. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with all of you. And we do have about an hour and 15 minutes of presentation time, and then time for question and answer at the end. But if you do have questions as we go through, don't feel like you have to wait until the end of the presentation. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, or I will stop a couple times throughout the presentation and ask if you have questions as well. And if you do have a question, you can come off mute and you can ask the question orally, or you can type the question. You can also ask the question in English or in Spanish, since I am bilingual Spanish-English. So whatever is easiest for you. So with that said, let me go ahead and pull up my screen that I have here, my presentation. All right. Can you all see my screen? I can see Laura on my screen, so I'm looking for Laura to shake her head. Okay, wonderful. So our objectives for tonight's session are to explore how bilingualism impacts the brain, and also to examine strategies for supporting your child's bilingual development. To get started, I would love to find out a little bit about, are you a parent of an infant, a toddler, a preschooler? Do you have an elementary age child? I would love to have you put in the chat box what age children that you currently work with. And if you just want to type that in the chat box. Oh, elementary, wonderful. Oh, a 15-month-old. Okay, great. And a 3-year-old, oh, perfect time to be talking about this. And a 2.5-year-old preschool, 2 elementary age students, but you work with students of all ages. Wonderful. Okay, that's great. So we have a lot of that really early childhood focus, which is wonderful. So, whoops, let me see if I can. Sometimes when I pull up the chat, then it's hard for my computer to want to get started again. So let me move away from the chat. So, as we get started, I think it's important to look at the language diversity that we have across the United States. And why is this an important topic? Why is it important to talk about the impact of bilingualism on young brains, and then also how we can support bilingualism? So, I am curious to hear from you. Which states do you think have the highest percentage of children and families who speak a language other than English? If you can just type in the chat box. Which states do you think have the highest percentage of children and families who speak a language other than English? And put 3 or 4 or 5 states in there because I'm really curious to see what you come up with. Okay, the Florida, Texas, California, New York. All right, you guys are pretty on target already. Texas, California, Texas, Texas, California, Florida, New York, Texas. Any other guesses besides California, Texas, New York? Okay, I see Ohio, Michigan. All right, that's a good guess. Washington, maybe, California. All right, so let's see. So coming in at the top spot there, we have, whoops, there we go. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move my chat box over here. California, 44% of children and families in California speak a language other than English. That's almost half. So talk about the importance of bilingualism and dual language learning and how that impacts our brain. It's so important. Texas comes in second at 36%. New Mexico, I know there was someone who had mentioned New Mexico there. And then New Jersey. I don't know if anyone said New Jersey. A lot of folks don't think about New Jersey, but New Jersey is on the East Coast, and there is quite a mix of languages and ethnicities there. And that's also a place where immigrants have migrated over generations. New York is right behind New Jersey, followed by Nevada. I know someone said Nevada there. And then Arizona and Hawaii both come in at 26%. So, as we look at the languages that are spoken around the United States, what are the top 5 languages that you think are spoken in the US? And go ahead and type that in the chat box. What are the top languages that are spoken around the United States? Spanish, yeah, definitely Spanish. That's not a surprise. Spanish is the most common language other than English for sure. All right, Penny says Spanish, Mandarin, and Russian. Excellent guesses. Hindi. All right. Other guesses as we look at the other languages across the United States. Let's see what. Okay. All right. There's Rachel. Spanish, Mandarin, Russian, Hindi, Vietnamese, Farsi or Dari, Korean, Japanese. All right. Let's see what the demographics tell us. Spanish is number one, not a surprise. Second most widely spoken language in the United States is Chinese. And as we look at the US Census data, they are including Mandarin and Cantonese in the category of Chinese. Third most widely spoken language then is Vietnamese, followed by Korean. And I saw that Laura had mentioned Korean. And then Tagalog, which is what they speak in the Philippines. And Russian, Maria Rodriguez had said Russian there. French Creole is in the top 10. Isn't that interesting? Arabic, all right, and Portuguese. So it's interesting to see what that language distribution and what those languages are, the most widely spoken languages across the US. So then, what do you think the most widely spoken languages are in Oregon? So let's narrow our focus from national down to the state of Oregon. What do you think the top 5 most widely spoken languages are? As we look at Oregon, what are the top 5 most widely spoken languages? And in Oregon, I didn't share this demographic earlier, but we're right about 16% right now of Oregonians that speak a language other than English at the home. So we're not in the top 10 or in the top 20 state, but we are definitely becoming more diverse. It used to be about 12% a few years ago, so we're becoming more diverse. All right, so in Oregon, it is, there you go. We had someone say Vietnamese, Chinese, Spanish, and Russian. You guessed almost all of those that we have on there. Yes, Spanish is the most widely spoken language, followed by Vietnamese. is the second, followed by, again, Chinese, which includes Cantonese and Mandarin, and then Russian and Korean. And I know certainly in different pockets around the state, the top 5 languages may be a little different. It may be a little different in the Beaverton area than it would be, say, in the Salem area or out in Eastern Oregon. But it's still interesting to see what that language diversity looks like. So why is this important? Why is it important to talk about language diversity and to look at the impacts of being bilingual? Um, so I want to talk about what a bilingual brain is. So the title for today's session is looking at building bilingual brains. Well, a bilingual brain is one that can process and switch between 2 languages. And so bilingual brains involve enhanced and neural meaning neurons. Those are, what's the cells that you have in your brains. A bilingual brain has enhanced neural activity in key regions of the brain. Because of that, it also leads to unique patterns of brain connectivity and function. So yes, being bilingual directly impacts the synapses that are building between the neurons in the brain, and it actually impacts the activation and the wiring that's happening in the brain. So this next slide is very kind of terminology heavy, but if you're like me, I like to dig into the science of this stuff and even learn some new words as I'm going in. So I want to talk just a little bit about what areas of the brain are we seeing that activity in. So we know that in bilingual brains, there is more active, there's more dense gray matter, and gray matter is what often is called the cerebral cortex. And so there's more density in the cerebral cortex because of the activity, because of the activation that's happening there. We also see that bilingual brains have improved working memory and attention, which are both part of executive functioning skills. So we hear a lot in early childhood these days about executive functioning skills. And executive functioning skills include the ability for a child to hold something in memory, and their working memory for short term. It includes the ability to pay attention and then also to persist on a task, particularly when confronted with challenges or obstacles or distractions. So it's really interesting that as we look at the bilingual brain, there's more activity, more density of brain matter in those areas that control executive functioning. So we're seeing that indeed children who are bilingual and adults who are bilingual have more working memory, attention, and cognitive flexibility, and they show faster development in some of those key neural circuits. As you look down here, we can see a couple diagrams. This first diagram on the left is a simplified diagram of a brain in someone who is bilingual Spanish-English. And we can see the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the very front part of your brain. If you want to touch right in your forehead, this is where your prefrontal cortex would be. And so as you look at the prefrontal cortex, you can see a lot of area that is being activated, a lot of neural connections and synapses that are being made there. And then same as you look at the parietal cortex. You can also see that activation, that area that is lit up in the brain of someone who is bilingual Spanish-English. And so in that parietal lobe, as you can see, it's also a little bit behind, kind of behind into the upper part of the head, behind the prefrontal cortex, kind of at the top and the back of the head. When you look at the brain scan of the monolingual English only child, you don't see that level of activity. You don't see that circuitry that is literally lighting up because it's being activated. So here's our terminology. Here's our kind of medical terminology for today. So as we look at what is actually happening in the bilingual brain, in the prefrontal cortex, there is greater activity in the area, as we mentioned, around working memory, cognitive flexibility, and attention control. And then the parietal lobe, if you want to touch the top of your head towards the back, we can also see this is where language comprehension and number processing occurs. And we also have increased gray matter density here. So it's interesting that you're seeing, because of the synapses that are being built, you're really activating those neurons and those synapses, and it's causing that denser gray matter, the cerebral cortex, which allows the firing and the development of that area of the brain. In Broca's area is a part of the brain. It's on the left-hand side, right around here. And I think you're not seeing a mirror image of me, but I'm touching the left-hand side of my head there. And the Broca's area of the brain is what controls language production. And so we also see that that language of the brain, when they do studies, and have the electrodes and such hooked up, it is more intensely engaged in bilinguals, especially when they're actively talking and engaging in grammatical tasks. So again, we're seeing the area of speech that's used for monolinguals and bilinguals is more actively engaged in the Broca's area. And then we have the caudate nucleus, which is kind of a C-shaped structure deep within the brain. And that also plays a key role in managing the two languages and selecting the appropriate one. And its function is language control and switching back and forth. And again, this is in one that would be activated, particularly as a child is switching back and forth between, say, maybe Farsi at home and English in their early learning environment. Or if dad speaks Spanish and mom speaks English, and that child is learning to navigate between those two contexts. And then the last area of the brain that we see a really direct impact with bilingual development is in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is what is involved with, really consolidating and making memories, as well as helping children and helping adults commit new knowledge to memory and involved in that learning process. And so this also, the studies are still fairly new on this, but it also does appear to show increased volume or activity as language learning enhances those memory systems. So we are seeing some real direct brain development, a real direct impact on brain development as even young children are engaged in learning a second or sometimes third language. So when does the brain learn best? We know that early childhood is a critical window for language acquisition. The brain is highly plastic and it's receptive to multiple languages. At birth, a child's brain doesn't know if it's born in Russia or Mexico or Portugal. So the brain is capable of learning multiple languages from birth. It has that neuroplasticity. We also know that native-like fluency is most easily achieved before the age of 7. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't learn a second language as adults, or that students who, start learning English when they're in middle school, or that folks who start taking a second or language in high school. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It means it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to take a lot more intentionality, a lot more exposure, and a lot more motivation to learn the language. I'm curious, how many of you learned a second language in early childhood? If you can type in the chat, how many of you learned a second language in early childhood before the age of 7? If you can say, yes, I did, or no, I learned a second language, but not until as an adult. I learned a second language as an adult. I started taking Spanish in middle school. Well, middle school here, when we have it kind of backwards, I believe, in the United States, that we start introducing children to a second language in middle or high school. And that's when kids are focused on a whole lot of other things besides learning a second language. There's a lot of hormones going on, and they are really more focused on, the social aspect of school. So that's when I started learning Spanish. And then it took years of me trying to learn Spanish. And it wasn't until I moved to Mexico in my 20s that I was really able to understand and gain a higher level of fluency and proficiency in understanding and speaking Spanish. So
Yeah,
let me go back.
I was gonna say we do have a question in chat. It's in Spanish, but I'm gonna try. ¿Hasta qué edad los niños pueden aprender varios idiomas?
Ah, gracias, Laura. Hablas español. You did that very well, Laura.
Poquito. I speak French better.
Excellent. Um, so there is not a cutoff date. So there is not a date like, oh gosh, this child is 10, you're not able to learn a second language anymore. There is not a cutoff date. So a child, a teenager, a young adult can continue to learn a second language, but what it's going to take is motivation to learn the language. It's going to take ample exposure to that language and ample opportunity to use that language. That's why many times for folks who try to learn language, for example, in the United States, when we try to teach high schoolers Spanish or French or whatever language it may be, and they learn it for an hour a day, but then they go back into an environment where they're not exposed to French or Spanish or other language they're learning. They don't have opportunity or motivation to use it. They don't have it reinforced. You're not going to use it. There needs to be opportunity, motivation, and exposure consistently and on a daily basis to really encourage the development of that second language. And I see we have another comment in chat. Let's see. And Rochelle said, I heard Spanish as a young child from family members, but really started to speak it in middle school. Okay, great. Well, Rochelle, that's wonderful. That is wonderful that you were developing those receptive skills even as a young child. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, because even if children don't start using those expressive skills and speaking back, you are developing those receptive skills and building that receptive vocabulary, which can be drawn upon later. So great. I'm glad you had that experience. So some of the benefits of bilingualism, as we mentioned, cognitive flexibility. As children learn to navigate between two or more language systems and two or more contexts that use those different languages, it really helps them to have that cognitive flexibility. And this is really one of the standouts in the research, that bilinguals definitely have superior cognitive flexibility. Not surprisingly, it also boosts problem solving, multitasking, and emotional regulation. Again, think about if you know two languages or three languages and you're thinking about, okay, how do I say this? You know, even when children code switch and they mix part of one language with another part of another language, that's part of problem solving. They're thinking, okay, I really want to explain or express this thought, but I don't quite have the words in Spanish. So I'm going to, add in a piece in English or vice versa. So it's boosting their problem solving skills along with that cognitive flexibility. It enhances academic and career adaptability. That does not surprise us. Anyone is bilingual most likely has more opportunities in terms of career options and academic possibilities as well. And really interestingly, for those of us who are a little bit older, this is another motivating factor for us to learn a second language. Bilingualism is linked to delayed onset of dementia. Isn't that fascinating? So there are many studies that have been done that continue to support this, that being bilingual has a delayed onset of dementia and cognitive decline. It's not surprising, though, when you go back to what we were just talking about, all those benefits of brain development and all those areas of the brain that are being activated, it doesn't surprise us that it's because of that brain development that is ongoing, that they're continuing to use throughout life as they use those bilingual skills. It's warding off dementia and that cognitive decline. All right, so I do want to go ahead and hop in and start talking about, all right, so these are the benefits, and this is the impact on brain development. So what do we do? What does this look like? So I've arranged this around questions, and these questions formed the contents of a booklet that the late Dr. Patton Tabers and I co-wrote together around commonly asked questions that family members had around supporting their child's bilingual development. So, how can I help my young child learn to speak our family language? This quote comes from Sochi, who was originally from Mexico. And she says, we read books, sang songs, and played games in Mixtecan when my children were little. We knew we had to keep the language going since it is who they are and where they are from. Now, interestingly, Mixtecan was not a written language. It is a Mayan language. They call it a dialect, but it's a completely different language from southern Mexico. And so when Sochi immigrated here, they didn't have books. So they actually started writing and developing their own books through at the local migrant Head Start program that they attended. But she knew that she wanted to keep Mixtecan alive. And so in this particular family, Mixtecan was the home language, Spanish was the second language, and then they added on English as the third language. And so it was really important to Sochi to keep that language alive through the reading of books, singing songs, and playing games. We know that children start learning the family language in utero, right around 5 months post-conception. So when the mom is still pregnant, that's when the fetuses have the ability to hear, and they can hear the voices around them. So they can hear mom's voice, they can hear other voices in the environment, whether it be dads or their older siblings or grandmas. So interestingly, 5 months post-conception, children are already starting to tune in to the sounds of the language that they hear. They're already starting to recognize voices. There's a really interesting study that Dr. Barry Brazelton has done with a newborn. And Dr. Brazelton holds the newborn, and then he has dad on one side and Dr. Brazelton is on the other. And they're both saying the child's name. And they look to see which side, which side the newborn turns their head to look at. And every time it's towards dad, because the newborn, even upon birth, recognizes the sound of their father's voice over that of Dr. Brazelton. They turn to that familiar sound. So, speaking the home language, speaking the language of love, the language of your heart, is developing those emotional bonds. Interestingly, when children start to babble, all babble initially sounds the same. So when babies start babbling, usually the cooing starts around, 3, 4 months old, and they're doing those soft vowel sounds, the ooh, the ah. And then the babbling starts around, 5, 6, sometimes 7 months old, where you're starting to get the ma, 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 ba, ba, ba. And so with that babbling sounds the same in any language, in all languages around the world for the most part, which is really interesting. If you look at some of the early words for mother or father in different languages, what do you notice as you look at this chart of languages and the words for mother and father? What do you notice about how similar they are? Yeah, if you had a chance to read through that chart, we can see the words for mother in Aramaic as ama, and then French maman, and then you go into mama, 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 mama. So how is it that the word for mother in all these languages is exactly the same? Well, think about it. If a child's babbling and the child is babbling and the child starts saying babbling, because babbling usually consists of a consonant with a vowel. And so the child starts saying mama, mama, mama. What do we do as mothers when we hear our child start babbling? You said mama, you said mama. And we get excited. Well, what does that do? That reinforces that child's utterance. That reinforces what the child just said. And so then the child gets excited and starts saying mama again. And so around the continent, around the globe, the word for mother is a derivation of mama. So I think that's really interesting. And even for father, it's pretty similar. Abba, papa, baba, baba, papa. So I think really fascinating to see that similarity there. So one of the things that babies need to hear, well, babies need many things at birth, but they need to hear the sounds of language. And not only do they need to hear the sounds of language, babies need to see lips, tongues, and teeth. Even though babies are able to start hearing in utero, when they're born, let me get a little interesting tidbit. Upon birth, the least developed sense, the least developed ability that children have of the five senses is their eyesight. At birth, children can see about 12 inches from their face, which just so happens to be, if you're holding a baby, cradling a baby in your arm, that's about 12 inches from the crook of your arm to your face. And so as we hold babies, how many of you have noticed that the babies will just tune in and watch your mouth? They're watching how your lips move. They're watching how your teeth move, how your tongue move. They're kind of taking statistics and watching how your mouth forms the words. So what does this mean? This means that babies need human interaction and contingent responding to develop language. Contingent responding means, for example, the baby says, mama, mama, and then you respond, Mama, mama, are you smiling at me? Are you smiling at mama? And then the baby smiles and goes, mama, mama. That contingent responding when the baby makes a sound and then the caregiver or the parent responds. And we call it that reciprocity or that dance of communication, that interaction. And so television and videos don't provide that. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children under the age of 2 watch zero TV or have zero screen time. So they should not be in front of iPads or phones or videos. They need the relationship, they need the connection, they need to see the faces and see the mouths of the parents and the caregivers who are talking with them. We also know that talking, singing, playing games, and reading with young children is so important. And doing that in the language of what your home language is so important for children to hear the rhythms and sounds and vocabulary of your home language. Um, I want to share just a shout out. I know the library, we have a audience of some librarians here, and so I'm sure they have all this information more. But when it comes to reading books with babies, we want to make sure that we try to take the time to read with babies and toddlers and preschoolers daily. And one of the questions that I get is, from families or maybe parents who say, but I don't know how to read. I'm from a culture, I'm from a community that we didn't have a written language or we didn't know how to read. And I say, guess what? Your child doesn't know how to read either. And your child's not going to know if you know how to read. So talking the book, taking the opportunities to talk about the picture. Oh, mira, hay una mariposa aquí. Mira la mariposa. La mariposa tiene olas rojas. Oh, look at the butterfly. Oh, look at the butterfly's red wings. So giving children opportunities to interact with books. And at this age, we want books that can go in the mouths because we know that's how babies like to explore because babies are in that sensory motor phase and books do go in the mouths. And so we don't want to be saying, no, 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 that doesn't go in your mouth. We want to give them books that they can actively explore that way. So books that are washable, books that are cloth. We want board books that their little chubby fingers as they get older can be able to pick up those pages and turn. We also want high contrast illustrations, particularly for infants. As I said earlier, at birth, children have very poorly developed eyesight. And so books with high contrast illustrations like black and white, or maybe just a simple image against a contrasting white background is really important because it helps them be able to see that. Books that children can interact with, that they can touch and feel, and that are sensory. And then particularly for language, simple stories with repetitive language. So simple stories where children, they hear that story again and again, and they know what that language is, and they know what maybe the missing word is, and that refrain. And then books with actual photos. Um, Studies have shown that babies have a propensity to look at faces. Babies love to look at faces of other babies. So making sure that we have books of children, books of faces, books of whatever they may see in their environment, cats and dogs, and then reading to your children in your home language. And then, as I said, wordless books as well, because you can just talk the book. You don't have to necessarily read the book. Um, I'm going to come back to this one in a little bit as we talk and we start talking about working with older children. Um, and I just want to again emphasize that children are born with the ability to learn all the different systems of languages. It's not until about 10 months old that as children are being exposed to all the languages, all the sounds around them in their environment, right around 10 months old, their brains start going through this first kind of pruning. And they start tuning in just to the sounds that they hear around them. And they need to be able to do that to be able to replicate those sounds. So if children are exposed to another language or two languages from birth, they are more likely to be able to reproduce those sounds with native-like proficiency. So a question we often get is, oops, let me check the chat here. It looks like, Yes, they all use the same vowel sounds, similar onset and sounds. Yes, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that when we were looking at the words for mama and papa. So this quote was from Michelle, a mother of two children who were raised as Spanish-English bilinguals, and she says, "The language of love was my home language. The language of love was my home language, and for my partner, his language of love was his home language. What was most natural for us was for me to speak English, my home language, and him to speak in Spanish, his home language. So we would speak to each other and to the children in different languages, but we all understood what was being said. So in their home, she spoke English and he spoke Spanish. So the children were really getting that pretty fairly equal amount of exposure and opportunity to use both languages because they had one parent that spoke one language and another parent that spoke another language. And I'm curious, I would love to hear if any of you who are on this call have done something similar in your homes, or maybe if you were raised that way. Do any of you have experience where one family member or one parent is speaking one language, or another family member or another parent is speaking a different language in the home? If you do have that experience, if you could put that in the chat box, that would be great. I'd love to see that. So while we're waiting for that, so I raised my two daughters bilingually, and we followed that same system. Let me see what we have in the chat box here. Yeah, that's great. Similar to my own experience and now for my children. Fantastic. And that's what we had done in our home. Even though Spanish was not my home language, it was not the language of my heart, I really valued bilingualism and wanted my children to be bilingual. So when my daughter, who's now 20, was born, we chose for me to speak Spanish to our daughter. And then my husband, who was a monolingual English speaker, spoke English to our daughter. So it was really interesting. We would have this dynamic at home. My husband and I would speak English to each other because he didn't know Spanish, but my daughter and I would speak Spanish to each other. And then my daughter and husband would speak English to each other. But what was really fascinating about that was that by, I would say, about the age of 2.5 or 3 years old or so, my daughter would be able to switch so fluidly from one to another. And she would know that when I was speaking Spanish to her, that her father would not understand Spanish. So she ended up taking on the role of interpreting for him. So, for example, if it was bedtime at night and I would say, ok, mi amor, 5 minutos más, ya es tiempo de dormirse. ¿Quieres una taza de leche antes de dormirte? And then my daughter, Della, would turn and look at my husband and say, Dad, 5 more minutes. I got to go to bed. I'm going to have a glass of milk. And it was really interesting that that was not something that we expected, but she started naturally taking into account, okay, Dad doesn't speak this language, so I'm going to interpret for him so that he's still included. And so she actually would do that quite a bit, particularly when she was younger. So research data, and this comes from the work of Paradise, Genesee, and Crago. Research data from prenatal and preverbal infants suggests that they have innate capacities that allow them to learn two languages without significant cost to the development of either language, provided they receive consistent and adequate exposure to both languages on a continuous basis. So yes, babies can hear 2 or 3 languages right from birth. What's important is that you use the language that you feel most comfortable with. Um, Again, you can do that one adult, one language rule that, okay, if you have two parents that speak two different languages, one parent can speak one language, one parent can speak another. I know another family that took a different approach. Both the parents were bilingual, and they chose that when they were in the house, they would speak Spanish, and they were outside of the house in public, they would speak English. But what was important is that they had a structure to ensure that they were intentionally providing that exposure and opportunity to use both languages. And I'm going to take just a stop here and look in the chat. And Rachel says, now that our sons are reading, my husband a native speaker, reads to them in Spanish, and I read to them in English, native speaker. Great. Both of us speak Spanish at home 95% of the time since they were born, but our kids mostly want to speak English with each other now. Yeah, and we'll talk about that coming up, Rachel. And that's really common that particularly if they have a sibling and they're getting a lot more exposure in English in the school setting, that many times at home, then they'll start speaking English because it's the dominant language in the community. And so then that'll put you and your husband in kind of this moment of you have to decide, are you going to continue to support Spanish at home? And we'll talk about that as we go forward here a little bit. And David says, my wife is American Spanish bilingual, and I am Spanish. We are raising our daughter, Mila, bilingually. Fabulous. That's wonderful. So I do want to briefly talk about the differences between simultaneous and sequential dual language development. So typically, simultaneous development is when children are being raised with two languages from between birth up to 3 years old. So before the age of 3, if a child is hearing and learning, it sounds like in some of the cases that some of you have already expressed, Spanish, English, or Russian English, whatever it may be, the process of language development is the same in both languages. And so that child would be considered a simultaneous dual language learner because they are in the process of learning both languages at the same time. And then the other type of language development for dual language learning is sequential dual language development. And sequential means that usually the second language is being added on after the age of 3, after the child has a foundation in the home language. Now, some of you may say, but gosh, a lot of 3-year-olds still don't speak a lot yet. But still, at that point, by the age of 3, children have been receiving that linguistic input and have been developing that receptive vocabulary and should have some expressive vocabulary. So that if you're adding on another language, then that would be considered sequential dual language development. And so it is happening after that first language has been established. Let's see, and we have another comment in the chat here. Neither me or my husband are native speakers. We both know a good bit, but she's starting to surpass us due to being in Spanish immersion preschool. Excellent. How do we keep up and continue exposing her as she goes into English-speaking kindergarten? We're not having a lot of luck getting her into elementary immersion programs. Thank you for that question, Michelle, and we will talk about that. That's one of the questions we have coming up here in just a minute, so we'll definitely get to that here in a minute. Other questions? I'm going to pause. I'm actually going to stop sharing for just a minute. And if you want to come off mute and actually ask a question, I would love to hear your questions.
Hi.
Yes. Hi, David.
Hi. So we had a question. My wife is here with me, Allison, and our daughter, Mila. Do you want to ask?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
We've heard different, well, first of all, it's just supremely important to us that Mila speaks Spanish and English because David is from Spain. And we're both bilingual. But we've heard different stories about, children falling behind in school to a certain age. Is there anything we can do to support her for that to not be as big of a hurdle, or is that just sort of a normal brain development thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly research studies do show that initially children who are being raised bilingually may say their first word a little bit later. On average, the children say their first word around 12 months old. And there are studies that show that if children are being raised bilingually, they may say their first word a little bit later than that. And that their vocabulary may not be quite on par with their bilingual peer or with their monolingual peers initially. What we do see typically is right around 3rd grade that the bilingual children start to catch up to their monolingual peers. And then by 5th grade, they have surpassed them. One of the things that I would say too is that you also want to look at, if you're looking at how are you assessing, are they behind? Is that assessment based on expressive vocabulary? Is that assessment based on reading? If the assessment is based on expressive vocabulary, you don't just want to look at one language and say, well, gosh, they only have, 4,000 words in English in preschool, where they should be up to 5,000. There's research that says that when children enter pre-kindergarten, they should, have knowledge of about 5,000 words to be successful in kindergarten. Well, you don't want to just be adding up the words that a child knows in one language. You want to look at that total sum of words that they know between English and Spanish, because otherwise you're going to be comparing, apples to oranges and say, well, gosh, they look behind because maybe they only know, a few hundred words here, a few hundred words here, but together in the totality, what does their vocabulary look like? And yes, the studies do bear out that they do start catching up in 3rd grade and then typically have surpassed by 5th grade. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes is that when children may be a little behind in starting to read or in their expressive vocabulary, sometimes schools have told parents, gosh, look, it's confusing them. You should only speak English, or you should only speak Spanish, or whatever, usually they say you should only speak English. You don't want to give up the home language. Whatever anyone tells you, and I know sometimes speech language pathologists would say, gosh, it appears there's a delay, so we recommend just using one language with the child. So in that instance, you want to really hold firm and know that you want to continue promoting bilingual development. And yes, there may be some initial delays, but they will come back and surpass once they get further into elementary school. But really looking at how in your home you are intentionally providing that really language-rich environment, building vocabulary, intentionally bringing new words into the home in English and Spanish, doing book reading in English and in Spanish, doing singing in English and in Spanish, and also encouraging your child to be involved or taking your child to other community events where they're hearing and seeing how cool Spanish is, so that Spanish doesn't start taking, that back seat or the back burner, and then they don't want to speak Spanish and just focus on English. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, it really did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Any other questions before we continue on?
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Oh, I don't know whether it's me. Oh, hi. Both my baby is 15 months old now, and both grandparents and parents and bigger brother speaks Mandarin at home to him. Just wondering when we should introduce English to him, because we're both not native speakers. Should I bring him to learn English to the story times and read books to him in English and Mandarin at the same time? And it's like, because I want him to gain the fluency to both languages. When should we introduce English?
Yes, and that's a great question. That's wonderful that you have that linguistic resource and having the grandparents there. That's fantastic to be able to support the Mandarin development. And I'm glad that you asked, when should you introduce English? When should you start exposing them to English? And I would say now. Again, you don't want to bring in English at the risk of losing Mandarin, and it doesn't sound like that's going to be the case since you speak Mandarin and the grandparents speak Mandarin. But certainly exposing them to the sounds and the rhythms of English is going to help them when they then start acquiring that receptive vocabulary, and then also that vocabulary and that sound system they're going to need when they learn to read in English. So yes, if you have access and the time to go to the English speaking story times at the library, that's fantastic. Because it's certainly, again, you do not want to do it at the risk of, that subtractive approach that you're learning, that you're taking away from Mandarin. But because you have that wonderful linguistic resource at home, then yes, you do want to start that exposure to the rhythms and sounds of English as well.
So should I translate both English and Mandarin to him at the same time? Tell him like a cup can be spoken to 2 different ways at the same time to him?
What we try to do, one of the recommendations, and we'll talk about this a little further ahead, is not to do we call that simultaneous interpretation. When you say, for example, oh, it's time to eat, es tiempo de comer, please wash your hands, vamos a lavar las manos. Because one, what children start to do, they will tune out the language that they're not as familiar with because they know that they're going to hear it in their home language. And then also, it can be a little confusing, even for the adults, if you're constantly going back and forth between those two languages and saying, okay, I say it in Mandarin, I say it in English, I say it in Mandarin. But what I would do instead is look at, again, exposing them through story times. Maybe, at a certain time of the day, you're going to be talking about, pointing out, as you said, oh, this is a cup, oh, this is a plate, oh, dog, dog. And then when you're doing that, making sure you have context. So then when you're pointing out, like labeling objects like, a cat or a dog or the cup, that they actually then have a visual, they have something concrete to see to go with that word that you're seeing. So yes, you do want to bring it in, but I would not recommend switching back and forth because studies have shown that simultaneous interpretation back and forth is actually one of the least effective methods for encouraging second language acquisition.
And Dawn, I just wanted to say a minute about the story times at the library.
Yes.
We have lots of dual language kids in our preschool and in our toddler story times, and we really intentionally use lots of props and simple stories. And so a lot of things they'll pick up because, I'll say head and you touch your head. So we really, this is something that we are really comfortable with at the library. You might need to do a little bit of translating at first, but you'll be surprised how quickly your child will pick up the English in story time.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Jenny. That sounds wonderful. I would love to come observe one of your story times. That sounds perfect. But yeah, so just as you said, using the props, using gestures, that is what helps children understand the language that's being spoken. So the more that you have the visual cues, the pictures, the real objects, the gestures, the more concrete and the more you're buttressing that communication and really helping children be able to understand what is being spoken. All right, I'm going to
Hola,
back in here.
disculpa,
Oh, yes.
¿sí puedo hablar en español?
Yeah, puede hablar en español,
Sí,
está bien. And then puedo interpretar en inglés, está bien.
ok. Bueno, no sé si lo he hecho bien. Yo soy madre soltera y le hablo a mi hija desde que estaba en la barriga. Ella va a cumplir 3 años y le he hablado siempre en español en la casa. Siempre que estoy con ella hablo en español. Pero ella ha ido para la biblioteca a story time en inglés, para las clases de natación en inglés, para cualquier actividad es en inglés. Entonces yo soy, como quien dice, la única que le habla en español. Y ella, a pesar de que va a cumplir 3 años, ella habla muy bien el español y siento que está entendiendo el inglés, aunque no lo habla, siento que lo está entendiendo cuando otras personas me hablan, otras personas le hacen preguntas, ella responde en español. No sé si lo estoy haciendo bien. A veces cuando voy a la biblioteca, lo acabas de comentar, no sé si he hecho mal que a veces por lo menos dicen los colores en inglés, yo le digo en español como para que vaya asociando porque no se lo sabe, pero ahora que comentó que no es bueno hacer eso, entonces voy a empezar a no hacerlo en español, sino dejar que ella lo escuche en inglés y írselo mostrando con alguna ropa o algo así para que ella lo vaya asociando. Pero a mí mi preocupación es cuando empiece la escuela, porque va a ser todo en inglés y va a ser más horas en la escuela y menos horas en la casa para hablar español. Entonces, ¿qué me recomiendan en esos casos?
All right, great. Thank you. So let me interpret back into English so everyone can know what her wonderful question is. So she says she's a single mom and she has been speaking in Spanish to her baby since she was pregnant. And she only speaks Spanish at home. And her daughter just turned 3. And she has been taking her to the library for the English story time. And she's done other classes and activities in English. And she says that her child is speaking Spanish very well now. And she seems to be able to understand English too, that when someone speaks to her in English, she seems to be able to understand and is able to respond a bit. And her concern or question was, when the child goes to school in English, then what should she continue speaking, or what should she do at home? And in that case, certainly, it sounds like you've been really intentional and not only supporting the home language development, but also exposing her to English, which is great. So continue going to story times. You know, if she's able to become involved in more activities in English and also community activities in Spanish to support both languages, that's fabulous. And then when she goes to school, it depends on what school she goes to. If she is lucky enough to get into a dual immersion school that is supporting both languages, I highly support that. Dual immersion schools are great. I know there aren't enough of them. Or if she's able to go to a school that does have some Spanish language supports, that's wonderful. If it's an English only school, then you'll really need to make sure that you continue to support Spanish and Spanish literacy in the home. Because what we do see sometimes is that families have continued to speak to their children in the home language. But then children go to school and they start learning to read and write in what? In English. But families continue to maintain the home language, but then they are not focusing on literacy. So there are many folks that have the verbal skills in their home language, whether it's Russian, Spanish, Farsi, Japanese, but may not actually be able to read or write in the home language. And so our goal is to have bilingual, biliterate children. So certainly in that case, if they are focusing on just reading and writing in English, then making sure that you're really intentional in how you're also supporting your daughter and developing those literacy skills in Spanish at home. So I hope that answered your question. All right, we will continue on. And so that was a great segue. And what type of preschool should I enroll my child? And so Ivelisse had the quote of, I had to give my kids time to learn English and to succeed in Spanish. It doesn't happen immediately, so it was difficult for my son. It was easier for my daughter, but they both still needed time. And certainly, how long it takes a child to learn English or to learn, both languages depends so much, again, on opportunity, motivation, exposure, also personality. A child who's much more shy and timid and maybe doesn't want to make a mistake or doesn't want to look silly and doesn't want to put themselves out there, it's probably going to take a little bit longer in that language learning trajectory. A child who's more outgoing and extroverted and loves to chat up people when they meet them, it's probably going to be a little bit shorter on that language learning trajectory. And so it also depends on the languages spoken at home. As one of you mentioned, that they have a sibling in the house. Many times when there's an older sibling, then more and more English is being brought into the home because they're learning that from the sibling. It also depends on the language of the kindergarten. If you are, again, fortunate enough to live in a school district and your child is going to be going into a kindergarten where both languages are spoken, that would be great to have them in a bilingual preschool if you have that option in your local community. If they don't, if they're going into, for example, an English only kindergarten, you'll definitely want to make sure that they're getting enough opportunity and exposure to learn English if they have not had that opportunity previously. So again, there is not one set answer. It depends on what languages are spoken in your home, what is the language of the kindergarten they're going into, and what is the amount of exposure in each language. What we know is that children need structured, intentional input in both English and the home language. So some of those school models that I mentioned, some are full immersion in English. The ones that I would love to see more widely available are dual immersion programs. Portland has been really a leader in dual immersion programs. I know Beaverton and Hillsborough have those as well. Sometimes they start off at a 50-50 model from kindergarten. Sometimes they start off at a 90-10 model. And then each year it continues to go 90-10, 80-20, and so on. So those are questions to ask. What program does your local school district offer? What does that dual immersion model look like? And for families that speak a language other than English, Another model that you may see is what's called the transitional bilingual, where they support home language for maybe the first 3 to 5 years with the goal of transitioning them out of that bilingual program into an English-only classroom. If that's the goal, that's great. But again, you want to make sure that they're having an opportunity to learn to read and write in both languages and not just focusing on English while Spanish or the home language is being gradually minimized. Other common program models in public schools that have been around for decades are the ESL pull-out. And this is what happened as a result of a Supreme Court case called Lau versus Nichols that said children who speak a language other than English have to be entitled to comprehensible input. You can't just put a child who doesn't have any English skills into an English-only environment and then expect them to learn. They have to have support so that they receive comprehensible input. And so what many school districts did in response to that Lau versus Nichols Supreme Court case is they instituted what was called the ESL pullout. This is a model that many of us probably were familiar with when we were in school 10, 20, 30 years ago, where maybe 1 or 2 times a week, the ESL instructor would come pull a group of children out and then work with them to make sure that they understand the content and work with them in small groups to support what they had been taught in English in the large group. Was that an effective model? ESL pullout is not the most effective model. So fortunately, we've seen other models that have emerged. ESL push-in is one of the models that's emerged, where they actually then have an ESL assistant who is embedded in that classroom, in that kindergarten, first grade, second grade classroom, to be able to provide that extra support and ideally extra support in that child's home language. So they're really able to get that comprehensible input. And so it's important to know, what does that public school model look like where your child is going to school or may go to school? Or if you have the option of a private school, what does that look like? And these are some of the questions. These are some of the, the questions that you want to ask. Is it a dual immersion? Is it a full immersion? If, the child doesn't speak English, what kind of supports are available to them? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the stages of second language acquisition. Now, again, some of you are speaking purely the home language at the home. Some of you are already raising your children bilingually. Some of you may be here because you only speak English with your child and you want to know how to introduce another language like Spanish or Japanese or Vietnamese. I want to share this next slide looking from the perspective, if you have a child, for example, who speaks only English at the home, only Spanish at the home, and then they go into a primarily English-speaking environment. These are the stages of second language acquisition that children typically go through in that English-speaking environment, whether that be preschool or kindergarten. So first, we see that children continue to use their home language. They will continue, if they go into an English-only environment, and there is not support for Spanish, they will continue to speak Spanish, trying to make their needs known and trying to get their needs met. But pretty soon, unfortunately, if there is not support for the home language, they will stop using that home language in that environment. And they move into what we call the nonverbal period. The nonverbal period is when children have gone into an environment that they realize their home language is not understood and it's not serving their need to be able to communicate, but they don't yet have enough English vocabulary to be able to express themselves or express their needs in English. And so typically in this nonverbal period, children will communicate with gestures while they are gaining that receptive and expressive vocabulary. But oftentimes they won't talk. They've stopped using the home language, and they also aren't using English because they simply don't have that English vocabulary yet. This stage is many times when teachers get concerned and also when parents get concerned. This is when sometimes we have preschool teachers or kindergarten teachers say, oh my gosh, I think something's wrong with the child. I'm going to do a referral to early intervention. The child isn't speaking at all. I think they have, significant language delay. I've had someone say that the child has selective mutism. So it's really important to know that this is a very typical stage of language development. And it's really important as parents to talk with that English speaking teacher and say, actually, they do speak a lot at home, and they are verbal, and they are engaging in expressive language. But it's a really common stage that children are in that nonverbal stage as they are gaining those receptive skills and that confidence to begin to using their emerging expressive English vocabulary. When children do start to emerge from that nonverbal stage, this is when you'll see children put 2 to 3 words together. This is also called the telegraphic stage. And this is when children will say, like, go outside, me hungry, or help, teacher. They don't have enough to do a complete sentence. They don't have enough vocabulary yet, but they've picked up on those key words to be able to communicate their needs. This is also when you'll start hearing children do that, what we call code switching, where they'll maybe have a word in English and a word in Spanish, like more jugo or mi cansada. And so it's really important at this stage, when you do hear that code switching, that you accept the child's utterance and you simply respond with that expanded sentence back in either English or in Spanish. So if the child says, more jugo, I would say, ¿quieres más jugo, mi amor? ¿Quieres jugo de naranja or jugo de manzana? So asking them, I ask them, oh, do you want more juice? Do you want apple juice or do you want orange juice? But recognizing that code switching and then responding with an extended and expanded response that filled in the missing words and then added additional information. So that nonverbal phase can last anywhere from a month up to a year. The telegraphic phase usually lasts a couple months, and then pretty soon you'll see that rapid English production start coming out. And then they move into the productive use of language. And this is when children start to begin using longer and more complex phrases, and then really moving towards more of that academic use of language. So interestingly, the fastest growing segment of the United States population are children under the age of 5 living in a family in which a language other than English is spoken. That is the fastest growing segment of the United States population. According to the 2020 US Census, about 32% of children in the US were growing up in homes where a language other than English is used. And that says by 2020. And yes, by 2020, there were more multilingual preschoolers than monolingual preschoolers in the United States. Isn't that amazing? More multilingual preschoolers than monolingual preschoolers. And so it's really important that we have this information for our own children, but then also to be able to advocate and share this with other children and other families. One of the things that I do want to just share, and this is one that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier about using gestures. So for those of you that are raising, your children bilingually, and maybe Spanish English or, Hindi English, if it's the language that the child is not as confident in, making sure that we provide gestures instead of doing that simultaneous interpretation, which I mentioned earlier, which is not an effective method. We want to use gestures all the time. So if you're asking a child, oh, are you cold? Are you cold? Would you like to read a book? Please put on your jacket and zip it up. It's time to wash our hands and brush our teeth. When we're communicating with children, we should be using those gestures all the time. It's raining outside. You need to put your hood on. So, and these are the same strategies I talk to when I'm working with our teachers, who sometimes our preschool teachers may have 5, 6, 7 languages in a classroom. And they say, wow, I want to support our children who are dual language learners, but I don't know how. I speak maybe 1 other language, but I don't speak 7 languages. So we talk about how to use gestures to support the understanding and to support children's receptive knowledge of what is being asked of them. So using gestures, pictures, realia is really so important. Also, I'm going to kind of skip past this a little bit. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to share just a couple of these. And I want to point out parallel talk and self-talk. These are 2 language promotion strategies that are great to help children learn language, period. Whether it's their home language, whether it's English, but it's really helpful to children to be able to learn vocabulary. So parallel talk is when you are describing what the child is doing. Your words are paralleling the child's actions. So when you say, wow, you are stacking the blocks so carefully, or you're moving your hand across that paper and making big yellow marks with the crayon, that's parallel talk. That is helpful because just as we mentioned with gestures, your words are accompanying what the child is doing. Self-talk is when you are describing what you're doing. I'm taking an apple and putting it on my plate. I'm pouring myself some milk and I'm setting the pitcher down. I'm taking a drink of milk. Do you feel silly doing this? Yeah. But guess what? It's helping children learn language because it's giving what we call buttressing communication. You're sending your words along with the gesture. And so that parallel talk and self-talk, whether you're a Spanish-speaking mom and you want to make sure that your child is getting that Spanish-speaking vocabulary, or you're the English-speaking model and your husband's a Spanish speaker, these are strategies that can help with all of the languages. The other thing that I really want to just focus on in our last couple of minutes here is teaching vocabulary intentionally. It is so important that we use a wide array of words with young children. For example, if you're talking about how that apple tastes, you don't just want to say, oh, the apple tastes good. You want to really use vocabulary to describe that apple. Oh, this apple is delicious. This is a scrumptious apple. Oh, this apple is sour. Oh, this is a sweet apple. So you don't just want to use the word good. Again, whether you're speaking in Spanish or English, but really being intentional in how you bring a variety of vocabulary words into your interactions with young children. So think about as you're talking with them during mealtime, you're driving with them in the car, how are you intentionally exposing them and then repeating that new vocabulary throughout the day? So the last thing I want to wrap up it with is, what if my child does not want to speak our family language? This comes from Tatiana, who came to the United States from Russia when her children were in elementary school. And she said, oftentimes when I ask questions or give directions to my kids, they reply in English. Sometimes I will not continue until they reply in Russian to me. That's one of the strategies, one of my ways to keep the language. And so sometimes children as young as age 3 may decide that they want to not speak the family language, particularly if the family language is not well represented in the community and they don't hear the family language spoken elsewhere than the home, because being bilingual is a lot of work. It is. It's easier for younger children than it is for older, but it still takes work. And the older the child is, the more challenging it is to remain bilingual. And then also, if children go into an English-only school in a primarily English-dominant community and their friends speak English, probably in elementary school, maybe around 3rd, 4th grade, they're going to say, Mom, just speak to me in English. It's so much easier. And so this is when you really have a decision to make because it is challenging. It's tough. One is, you can continue speaking to your child in your home language, and they may respond to you in English. So you may keep speaking to them in Spanish and they only respond to you in English. We actually call that bilingual discourse. Di means two. So when a person is speaking one language and the child understands that language, but then they are responding in the other language. And so they're speaking 2 different languages, but they both understand each other. So what is lost by that? Well, let's look at what is still gained. If you continue speaking the home language to the child, you are still developing those receptive skills. You're still developing those vocabulary skills. It may be harder for you if they're continually responding to you in English, but if you quit speaking the home language altogether and only respond in English, then you're not even having the opportunity to build up those receptive language skills. So what are some of the strategies? Sometimes I've heard parents say they pretend not to understand when the child uses English, that they say, oh, ¿qué dijiste? Or dime, I'm sorry, what did you say? So pretending not to understand when the child uses English, asking the child to, say that again in the home language, and then letting the child know how important it is to keep using the family language. Make sure that the language is present in the home in as many ways as possible. Again, reading books, singing songs, doing dances, attending events outside the home, spending time outside the home in places where the family language is used, respected, and revered so they can see the possibilities. Having family members that speak the home language come and visit, sending your children, or better yet, if you can go with them, to spend time with their family members who may live in a different country or different part of the world, so they can hear that language and maintain that connection to their family and their culture. It is tough, but it's one of those things. It's one of those gifts that you can give a child that will benefit them a lifetime. So many gifts we give children, as we know, they're forgotten about in a matter of weeks or months. Being bilingual is a gift that you can give your child that will benefit them the rest of their life. And so when this does come, when they, only want to respond back in English, this is when you're going to have to really make that decision. And at a minimum, if you continue to speak to them in the home language, you will still be building up those receptive skills. And I guarantee you, they will eventually want to continue and start speaking in the home language. I have not yet met an adult that says, "Man, I really wish my mom or my dad wouldn't have spoken my family language. I really wish my mom and my dad would not have spoken Russian or Vietnamese or Farsi to me." However, in contrast, I have met many adults who said, "Yeah, my mom didn't speak Spanish. I can't speak Spanish. My mom didn't speak Spanish to me because she thought it was going to hinder me. So now I can't speak Spanish, even though everyone thinks that, I'm Latina." Or, "Yeah, we don't speak German. My grandparents stopped speaking German." So I've met many adults who regret their parents not speaking the language to them, but I have never yet met an adult who regrets their parents speaking that home language to them.